Imagine spending most of your life believing that you had gotten away with murder only for your downfall to be caught on camera. Well, that is exactly what happened in the case of Rikki Neave. A 6-year-old boy leaves home for school but never returns, and as police attention zones in on those closest to him, including his mother, the question is asked, could the police be looking in the wrong place? Was every stone really left unturned? Was a mother bullied into a guilty plea? And who was really responsible for the disappearance of a schoolboy who went missing from his own estate? This is the tragic case of Rikki Neave.
Now, before we get into it, in this episode, we are going to be discussing themes of abuse, trauma, and mental health struggles. So if you are experiencing anything like that, we will be leaving resources in the description that you'll be able to click on and view for yourself. Also, we'll be discussing the tragic passing of young Rikki Neave as well. So just bear that in mind before watching this. Now, this case has twists and turns like you wouldn't believe, and it lasts for over 30 years. But why don't we start off with Joey setting the scene, if you don't mind, about what was going on at the time.
Yeah, so as Josh says, this case does stretch back 30 years or so, and we actually covered it on the channel in short form content, and that video went completely viral. There was such a first from the public and from people that follow us to actually hear more about this case, and it has been one that's been requested to us time in, time out by our subscribers, and I think it kind of intensified a lot in terms of the interest in this case, where 24 Hours in Police Custody actually did an episode on it, probably one of the better episodes of 24 Hours in Police Custody I've seen. And it all starts off, this case, in 1994 in Peterborough, which is a city in England, and we've actually visited Peterborough before with one of our cases. It was Joanna Dennehy.
Yeah, we will link the video right now on screen if you haven't watched that one. But that case itself was fascinating as well. Like a woman going basically on a spree, on a murder spree, wasn't it?
Yeah, and before her killing spree had actually started, long before it, there was an estate in Peterborough called the Welland Estate, and it was described by people that lived there as loud and chaotic. There were a lot of kids playing, there were a lot of laughs being had, but also, probably like any council estate that you will know or you would have grown up around, it did also come with its problems. It had poverty there. There was a lot of families that were requiring the use of social services. There was a fair bit of petty crime on the estate, including sort of kids shoplifting, pickpocketing, substance use. As I say, probably like any council estate that you'll find in England. And when I list the sort of things that were going on the estate, doesn't necessarily mean that I'm saying that Rikki was involved in shoplifting or anything like that. And I think what it's time to do right now is for Josh to give us a thorough rundown on Rikki Neave himself.
So Rikki Lee Harvey, as he was originally called, was born on the 4th of March 1998, and his biological parents were called Ruth Neave, originally Greg, and Trevor Harvey. The couple separated very early on in their relationship. Basically by 1991, Rikki was just 3 years old and they had parted ways. Basically, Ruth then went on to form a relationship with another man called Dean Neave, took his surname, and then gave Rikki that surname as well. But before I really tell you a little bit more about Rikki, I think it's also very interesting to tell you a little bit more about Ruth and her upbringing, right? Because it makes sense in terms of the story and how we tell this, because her childhood was also pretty bad. So Ruth herself had grown up in the care system. She'd moved between foster homes quite a lot, and actually starting from the age of just 2, she was also physically abused. So whether it was in these care homes and also by her own family, she suffered a lot of abuse and therefore had a lot of trauma as a result of this. And it got worse for her as well when she learned that her biological parents had actually self-deleted in a pact, and she basically found out after the fact that they had done this. And again, horrible circumstance for a young girl to have to deal with this, right? And then it gets to her teenage years where she was diagnosed with being an inadequate psychopath. I hadn't actually ever heard of this term before researching this video, but basically what it means at the time, because they don't categorize people in the same way anymore, is that this person didn't have any empathy for others, and she struggled to form any close relationships as a result. And I specifically mention this because she actually really struggled, therefore, as a mother. she didn't have that empathetic element of her. And as a mother, you really need to be, you know, a nurturing caregiver. And she wasn't very good at that at all. So Rikki was her first and only boy. And he was actually already on the child protection register due to concerns about his welfare from an incredibly young age. And neighbours actually remember seeing him be abused in plain sight on the estate, right? So this wasn't an unusual occurrence for him to actually be abused by his family. So, I mean, absolutely awful to be dealing with. And even though this little boy was only 6 years old, he also had to look after his siblings. They were called Rochelle and Sheridan. They were his younger half sisters. And he even looked after his older sister, Rebecca. He would be forced to shoplift food from local shops just to make sure they had something in their stomachs at night. And he also ran baths for all of his sisters to make sure they were clean. Remember, he's just 6 years old at this time. And through all this trauma and pain, Rikki was actually known as a very cheeky, very bubbly young lad. And so many other parents spoke about him fondly. And yes, he did get into trouble, especially because he wasn't being treated in the same way that a kid would be at his young age. He actually was known to go on substance runs, and mainly for his own mother. He actually picked up different substances for her. And also, really concerningly, he was very truant from school. He often missed certain days at school, and a lot of his teachers found out that he basically ended up turning up to school around lunchtime. And that was because he wasn't getting fed well enough at home. He'd come into school to actually get his free school dinner. And that is why free school dinners are so important for young kids, you know, in estates and in circumstances like this. So speaking of school, this takes us all the way to the morning of Monday, the 28th of November, 1994. Rikki, on this morning, had a very, very small breakfast that he made for himself. He dressed himself in his school uniform and he had a blue anorak on, and he left his home just before 9 o'clock, sort of 8:30 to 9 o'clock region. We don't know for absolute sure, which is important because that would mean that he'd already missed the start of the school day.
Yeah, so as you say, the 28th of November would have been the Monday, meaning he was actually supposed to be heading off to start his week at school, but he never turned up to the Welland Primary School. And obviously, once the school informed his mother, Ruth, she began to really, really worry, because despite the fact that Rikki did have freedom and he was allowed to go out on his own, walk to school on his own, clearly, Rikki wasn't known to actually stay out past the times that he was supposed to be in. He did used to head home from school. And therefore, as the hours went on, the worry that she had would set into panic, basically.
Yeah.
So much so that by 6 p.m, sort of 3 hours around the time that he was supposed to be home from school, she calls the police. And I get that this doesn't undo any of the allegations that have been made against her, what we'll go on to speak about, which is time she actually spent in prison. But one thing that I would say is it clearly was out of character for him to not return home by that point. Otherwise, she wouldn't have called the police. So I think that we always have to take this case with the amount of understanding that two things can happen simultaneously and still both sort of coexist. You can be a bad mum, but you can also be concerned when your child goes missing. And I think that that's something that I would definitely put across here in terms of like, look, it's not really for me to give my opinion. At the same time as that, this is our channel. I'll give it. I don't think she was a very good mum. I thought she was clearly a bad mum. At the same time as that, I do think that she was concerned when her son went missing. Therefore, she returned. She called the police when he didn't return home from school. And do you know what it is, right? She described herself as being paralysed with fear.
Yeah, I found this super interesting actually about this case, because you never truly understand how people are going to deal with the trauma of this. And her reaction was almost like deer in the headlights, wasn't it? She almost didn't quite know what to do. The fact that she even called the police is commendable. Like, straight away she reported him missing, but she didn't really do that much else, did she?
Well, this is the thing, right? Like, there's often a lot made of how parents respond in the aftermath to their children going missing. I can always see both sides of it. I can see a parent that would go out there, would be sort of pounding the pavement, making sure that they are leaving no stone unturned. They check all their favourite places. They go to the parks. They knock at their friends' front doors, houses. Yeah, I understand that side of it. I also understand the side of a parent who thinks the first place that he's going to head to if he's missing, or, you know, if he's with someone and they let him go, for example, will be his home.
Yeah.
And therefore, I can understand parents that do stay home in the aftermath. I personally, as a parent, cannot comprehend how I would feel in that moment. I can't comprehend and I often think about this when we research these cases, the first night, the first time that a parent goes to sleep without knowing that their childhood is in the safety of their own home. I can't comprehend that. I can't dip in to how painful that must be. And look, however you view her, unfortunately for Ruth Neave, her pain was just beginning, because less than 24 hours after she calls the police to tell them that her son Rikki Neave is missing, Rikki's body is actually found. 6-year-old Rikki Neave's body was left undressed and specifically posed in a star shape, with his legs and arms fully stretched out, even his fingers fully stretched out. Clearly, this was some sort of deliberate message left behind by the person that placed him there. Now, what was interesting about the location of the body, right? We've done multiple cases now where we've had to research and find out where bodies, once they were found. Normally, how far away would you say that is?
I think usually, on average, it would be about a 20-30 minute drive away. You basically want to take someone out of the local area so that they're not immediately found and try and find a secluded place. So, yeah, usually it would be a decent distance away.
And I think that if we look into the cases that we've covered, I would say around 20-30 minutes drive is normally where a lot of the bodies of missing people end up getting discovered. This one was just a 5-minute walk from the Welland Estate, right? It almost begs the question, did the perpetrator have a car or not? Did he have a vehicle or not? Because the reason that question's relevant is that when experts looked over the body, the clothing and everything like that of Rikki Neave, they kind of came to the conclusion that he had walked into the wooded area that he was found in on his own. What I say on his own, I mean unassisted. I don't mean that he wasn't in the company of anyone else, but I mean that he had probably walked in there unassisted. And that was because of patterns of dirt that were found on his clothing, and also because of sort of patterns in the mud that was found at the scene. And one thing that we do know is the perpetrator either didn't have or didn't decide to use a murder weapon, because the autopsy showed that the murder of Rikki Neave actually came as a result of asphyxiation, strangulation, and that actually came via his zip, basically, on his own jacket. So it wasn't like there was a murder weapon, a hammer, a knife, something like that was able to be recovered from the scene. It was literally the zip of Rikki's jacket that was used. And finally, this must be absolutely awful for the family and friends of Rikki Neave to hear, but that's the fact that his clothes weren't actually found with him. They were found discarded in a nearby wheelie bin, but one of the buttons off of his clothing was actually found on a leaf near his body at the scene, implying that he had been undressed at the scene. So now the police are dealing with a crime scene that implies that very possibly the victim may well have known the perpetrator. The victim may not have been forced to attend this scene, rather than be led in there potentially with a perpetrator. And that means that suspicion very quickly would fall on those closest to Rikki Neave.
And we see this trope so often, don't we, in these true crime cases? The first thing the police actually have to do is they have to look at the people closest to the victim. And this is what the police actually did in this case. They looked through all of the friends, the family, and they started honing in on Rikki Neave's mum, Ruth. Now, we've already said that they found it a little bit strange that Ruth didn't join the search parties for her missing son at the time. And it doesn't feel quite right. And as we said, we don't always know how people are going to react in these situations, but the fact that you're not out there pounding the pavement trying to find your missing boy, it does feel a little bit weird. And not only that, there was also other things that police just didn't quite feel were normal in this situation. Ruth actually did an interview with the media outside of her own home. She spoke to the general press, and her body language at the time didn't feel quite right. It felt like she was a little bit defensive, that she wasn't answering all of the questions, and it didn't feel like someone that was grieving with the loss of her son. But again, how do we even know how people are going to react in these situations? And people react differently. But there was very much a suspicion, especially from the police at this point, that she wasn't reacting in the right way, which was their opinion. And it's after these television interviews where neighbours and people around the estate actually start calling police up, and a floodgate of information is left wide open. There were complaints coming left, right and centre about the state of Ruth and her ability to become a mother. And the scale of neglect really became clear at this point. So as we've already said, Rikki was already on the Child Protection Services register. And that is because Ruth had admitted to burning the children with cigarettes and matches. She also forced them to stand for extensive periods while hitting them on the head. Dean, Rikki's stepdad, also admitted to punching him. Ruth also wrote the word idiot one time on Rikki's forehead, so much so that it was in permanent marker, and people saw this for days afterwards. So this wasn't sort of like an isolated thing. This was a continual behavioural trend that we kept seeing. And another horrific moment, she was also said to have sort of squirted washing up liquid in Rikki Neave's mouth and sort of forced him to stay there. Again, you can imagine him crying, feeling awful, having to deal with this, probably would be sick afterwards as well, and he still had to deal with it. It was absolutely awful. And this is where I suppose the trope of her not only being a bad mother but also a violent and potentially incredibly abusive mother really came out. And police really were having none of this. They were not happy with her behaviour, and they could see that this was a very dangerous aspect of her personality. So much so that they actually went and searched their family home. And this is the point in which Ruth actually says that she would murder Rikki, her own son, if he was not taken into care. Like, yes, she's not a good mum. Yes, she doesn't want to look after the kids. But to say that to Child Protective Services, how was there not more concern raised at the time? I mean, she's fully admitted it at this point. It's super, super strange, isn't it?
I think that possibly what could potentially be an answer there for you, and I'm just,
hypothetical,
obviously, is the fact that when people are applying for benefits, for example, when they're wanting stuff off of the government, right? I know this full well. People often heighten the reaction, heighten the consequence of what could happen if the government doesn't do that, for example. I'm not saying this was a benefit.
Yeah, but also, right? Yeah, but also, this is a pure cry for help, isn't it? When you're getting to the point where not only your neighbours are acknowledging it, but you yourself are saying, I cannot be a good mother to this kid. I'm not looking after him. I really need him to be taken into care for his own safety and his own well-being. Yeah. And that Child Protective Services still, at this point, don't do that.
Yeah.
It's a failure on their part.
I 100% agree with you. What I was doing there is trying to give you the context of, like, she could have been saying it. It might not have meant that she actually planned to ever go through with it. Sometimes, and I know this is the advice I would give someone, to be honest, if they were going to speak to anyone on the phone, I would say, play it up, make sure you really whatever, because that's the way you're going to get help a lot of the time. Yeah. All I'm saying is that's a trend that some people might go down. It doesn't, excuse the behaviour at all.
No, absolutely not. So right, now we get to the point where police they've learned all of this stuff. They know all of these complaints. They get into the house and they do a very thorough search and they start building evidence that they can find. Now, what you would expect to find at this point is maybe there's some DNA evidence, maybe there's something linking her to the crime, maybe there's clothes,
splattered blood, something like that.
Anything right around that, but there wasn't any of that stuff. But there was a lot of other stuff that the police were very concerned about, right? So the first thing they found is they found various true crime books, and be careful of your viewing history right now, because this could be linked in a potential crime in the future because you've watched this video, right? They've found in Ruth's house books about child murderers. They were books about Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, notorious child killers, right?
Funny that she'd go on to meet Myra Hindley, but yeah, let's carry on.
There you go. But not only that, they also found something quite interesting. The fact that Ruth was actually an author. She wrote a manuscript, a book called The Perfect Murder, a book in which a serial killer targets young women and feels no remorse for their killings. So potentially that might be some motivation for a potential crime, or maybe it was a confession in the eyes of the police. And also in the property, it wasn't just that. They found books about witchcraft and black magic, and she'd actually spoken to her neighbours, Ruth, and said that she was a high priestess and someone that was very much interested in the occult. There was a period of time in this sort of like 1990s era where the occult and Satanism and witchcraft was very much sort of like in the sort of public consciousness. And so people were very, very concerned about this. And I mean, for the police, all of this circumstantial evidence started building and building and building, right? Until they found one more thing. They were going through books and they found a painting. This painting was by Leonardo da Vinci. Interesting fact, I actually had one of these paintings up in my house when I was a kid. I remember this painting very clearly in my mind's eye. This was of the Vitruvian Man. It was a painting that da Vinci did from an anatomical perspective. And it shows a man spread out, right? It shows him sort of like, you know, there's two arms, two sets of legs spread out. And they thought this bared a very similar resemblance to the way that Rikki's body was unfortunately staged. Add all of this evidence together.
Can I just quickly, do you know where else that, what do you call it? The Vitruvian Man?
Vitruvian Man.
Vitruvian Man. Do you know where else that used to be?
Go on.
On my wall at school.
Yeah, there you go.
On the wall of the classroom at school, there used to be one. So
it was a very common sight.
Yeah.
But the police put all of these things together. They say, we've got a very good case against Ruth. And they say that's enough evidence to look into her as a prime suspect.
I think that without there being anyone else in the frame that anyone knows could have come into contact with Rikki, could have been with Rikki that day, and therefore no suspect there, I think that, are you clutching at straws? Yes. But if there is no suspect, the straws kind of need clutching at a little bit?
I'm sorry to say this, right? But clutching at straws is one thing that we've often said in true crime cases. We're talking about a mother with a clear background in neglect, with a clear background in violence towards her own kids, with a lot of evidence about murders, about torture, about other serial killers, about, you know, maybe a case of how the body's even been posed, right? That adds up to be, I mean, a decent thing to at least start going off, but then you've got to substantiate it as well, right? And that's what the police didn't do. But during this time, they also got some other eyewitness testimony, right? And they looked at some other people saying things about the case and things they'd seen on this day. And this actually comes into one of the key sightings, that someone was actually seen with Rikki. A little boy, a 13-year-old boy, actually, in fact, a teenager, right, was seen not by one person, but by several people at the time walking around with Rikki in the estate. And this is where police actually speak to one person in particular. Her name was Sylvia Clary. She was a school custodian. She lived in the estate. She spoke to police and she said that she'd seen a young boy in school uniform with an older boy. And the key thing is that she actually recognized this boy. His father actually lived behind her house, and she said that this boy was called James Watson, and she told police that this boy looked at her and waved through the window when he was with Rikki. But why don't you tell me, Joey? Because I don't know too much about this guy. Why don't you tell me about who James Watson actually was?
Yeah, so James Watson was born on the 1st of April, 1981, and he was also from the Welland Estate. And James had experienced a deeply troubled childhood. He was actually known for lying as a child himself. His dad was a lorry driver, but he used to tell the other kids at school and on the estate that his dad was a police officer. And from 9 or 10 onwards, things went from concerning to disturbing, if we're being completely honest. It started off with him bunking school, getting in your usual type of trouble, but by 10 he had started killing birds and other animals, and by the age of 11 Watson did something beyond disgusting when he assaulted another young boy. Now this child was just 5 years old at the time. He obviously didn't report it to the police himself. He told his mother, and his mother understood that something seriously concerning had happened. She went to the police, she told them, she gave them a step-by-step guide of how James Watson assaulted her son. But clearly the right measures were never taken in response to this, and by the age of 12 years old, Watson had been taken into a care home. However, this would only actually make his life spiral even more. He was caught at the care home self-pleasuring over catalogues that reportedly showed young boys in swimwear, and not only only that, to top it off, the other kids in the care home have reported him for keeping animal carcasses in his room. I mean, we're literally talking about the hallmarks of a future killer here, aren't we? And the pieces of the puzzle just keep coming together. He fits the criminal profile of someone that could have done it. There are a lot of people that think, well, hold on, he's a teenager, he couldn't have done this. You only need to look in the years prior in the UK to understand that teenagers and children can commit crimes against other children. And there was enough from the crime scene to suggest that Rikki's perpetrator could have been someone that was younger. 3 separate witnesses claim to have seen James with Rikki on that day. One of them is an old woman who said that she saw the two playing together that morning around the time that Rikki left his house. And she said it was right by Rikki's house that she saw them. And the other 2 witnesses said that they saw James walk in to the woods with Rikki. The same woods that Rikki Neave's deceased body was found in. And at this point, I think regardless of what the police have uncovered against Ruth Neave, the theory that James Watson has something to do with Rikki's murder has way more weight to it at this moment in time for me. And therefore, I think that the police need to get hold of James Watson and see exactly what he has to say about that day. And he does, but this is where the contradictions start, and they don't end quickly, because James first admits to seeing Rikki around the estate but says to the police that he has never been with the boy. Then he changes his story and says that actually he did know Rikki from seeing him about and had spoke to him, but crucially he never made any mention of coming near Rikki and definitely never stated that he touched Rikki.
So despite all of these sightings and how credible a suspect Watson actually was, he wasn't arrested. But someone was, and that was Ruth. She was actually arrested at this point. The police theory was that Ruth had killed Rikki in her home in a fit of rage, and potentially for like these ritualistic reasons that we've discussed earlier on, because of the reading that she was doing at the time of the witchcraft, the occult, that sort of thing, right? And they said that she placed the body in a buggy where she wheeled him, which is very important to remember, right? She wheeled him to the woods in the cover of darkness and left him there. The thing is that there wasn't very much evidence for this beyond the circumstantial stuff that we've already described. So this is when Ruth now goes to trial, and the trial happened in Northampton Crown Court in October 1996. She was charged with 2 things at this trial. The first thing was the murder, and the second thing was child cruelty. She obviously pled not guilty to the murder, but she did plead guilty to child cruelty regarding Rikki, but also all of Rikki's siblings as well. So it was a sort of a joint case against all of the children.
There is a lot of debate over what she actually pled guilty to. And the reason I say this is because after the case had obviously happened, she came out and said that she, 1, didn't know what she was pleading guilty to, and she was coerced by police into doing so. 2, she said she was under a lot of pressure to plead guilty for stuff that she had made it clear to the police that she wasn't guilty of. So where do we lie with that?
I think that's a load of rubbish, to be honest with you, because she has a solicitor with her. The solicitor would have made it very clear what was going on in the trial, and it would have made it very clear what she was pleading guilty for. So I personally feel that she pled guilty for the right things, right? She obviously, in her mind, and based on the evidence, she didn't actually need to plead guilty for the murder because she didn't do it. So then the child neglect thing, I think it's quite obvious. She's already spoken to Child Protective Services quite extensively. There's already all this evidence of friends and neighbours and people on the estate talking about her being neglectful and abusive to her kids. I think she pled guilty to the right thing.
By the way, it wasn't just people on the estate talking about her being neglectful. This had hit national newspapers and that sort of thing by this point. Public perception was at rock bottom of Ruth Neave. I can definitely understand why, do you know what I mean? And also what never helped Ruth was the fact that she went on the TV in the aftermath of Rikki's disappearance, didn't she? And this was before the arrest. She went on the TV, and can I tell you how, obviously there was a few different TV appearances, but one of them in particular where she sat, I believe, in a front room on her own. Can I tell you how I perceived it personally?
Go on.
I personally watched it and thought that Ruth Neave seemed very annoyed that people around her have maybe said, look, she's not the best mum, she's in trouble with social services and things like that. And for me, at that moment in time when your son's still missing, or you know, when we don't know what's happened to your son or who's responsible, for me, she read the room wrong. It seemed insensitive, and I can completely understand why, once those TV appearances had happened, with the underlying context of her history with social services, I can completely understand why the public at that point in time did think that Ruth Neave could be responsible.
But this is the thing, I think when you go back into the start of this episode, we talked about her mental state of mind, right? And we talked about her diagnoses as a teenager and the lack of empathy that she had as a person, right? I think this sort of, the reason why I brought it up at that time is because it's very important at this moment. I don't think she has a lot of empathy or understanding of the way that other people necessarily feel. I think she's in her own head and thinking about how she feels. Now, what's interesting about that is she getting annoyed about people thinking that she's a bad mum. She's gone to Child Protective Services and say, I'm going to murder Rikki if you don't take him into care. How is that not being a bad mum? I'm sorry. Like, you've admitted it to yourself that you're a bad mum because, one, you want him to go into care. Two, if he doesn't go into care, you're going to murder him. Do you think that makes you a good mum?
And as well, the other things that we're leaving out here, yeah, is we've only said stuff that was officially alleged against Ruth and stuff like that. In researching this case, there's things that probably doesn't have anywhere near the amount of weight we would want it to usually have, and therefore then might feature it in the case. And what I'm trying to say is we've heard some fucking horror stories in researching this case, haven't we?
Yeah, we really have. So much so that like, you can't always report on these things that were rumoured. Do you know what I mean? Like, you just can't do it. So there's certain things that we can and can't say and we won't say. But yeah, there's so much more to this in terms of different allegations that people have put forward. And if we'd done it, it would have been an extensive period of time, wouldn't it? Because of so much different stuff that we were hearing, right? So let me go back to the trial. At this point, you've got two sides, haven't you? You've got the prosecution and the defense. The prosecution were going off all of this circumstantial evidence that we've said, and also all of the occult theories and the Vitruvian Man, all of that stuff. Now, the defense, they went back on a very different way. They wanted to go back on a more scientific and testimonial evidence based on witnesses and that sort of thing, right? So we get to a few different things that basically meant that the case was just a joke. The first thing was the soil evidence. So what they did is they actually got a scientist, Tony Brown, and he testified that the mud that was found on the soles of Rikki's shoes, specifically a thing called the positive tread, which was basically him going into the mud, proved that Rikki actually walked into the woods. Now, you remember this, the police actually said that he was wheeled into the woods by Ruth, and that he was in a buggy at this point. Obviously, there would be very clear markings of a buggy in mud.
Of course, yeah.
And there obviously wouldn't be any markings of Rikki walking into the woods. So again, as soon as you go into anything scientific or anything that's actually physical evidence based, there isn't really a case to stand on in terms of accusing Ruth. But it wasn't just that. There was also then the time of death. So what we've talked about earlier on is the autopsy that we did. And obviously there's different stages to the autopsy. What you do is you sort of go through various tests. They looked at Rikki's stomach and they found that there was undigested food within that, which meant that he was murdered very soon after the time in which he had had his last meal, which was the Weetabix that he had for breakfast. So they said that was within about 2 hours or so. So, you know, within that sort of ballpark. So again, what the police had said is that she may have murdered him later on in the day, and therefore the evidence for the Weetabix and the actual stomach contents would have been very different. It would have been more digested. And then the final thing, there was this police officer that basically said that he was with Ruth at certain times, and basically his testimony was just thrown out. Like, they were calling into question his validity of his testimony quite extensively.
Can I tell you what it looks like from the outside looking in?
Yeah.
Perfect suspect.
Yes.
Not the perfect case against her.
Exactly.
Kind of looks to me a little bit like you've determined in your head that this woman is fitting for the crime. By the way, I'm not arguing it. I'm not saying she's not fitting for the crime. I'm also not claiming she is. But what I am claiming is I don't think you've got anywhere near enough evidence here.
So this is why I find fascinating at this point, because the trial went on for 26 days, even though we're going through all of this evidence. And I can understand going through it, right? But it's quite obvious for us. We've just read this, through in like 10 minutes. It's quite clear that there's not a lot of evidence on her. So the jury actually agreed, and they found Ruth not guilty of the murder, but because she had pled guilty to the child neglect claims, she was actually sentenced at this point to prison time. She actually was given 7 years in prison for neglect. Now, love to ask you your opinion. Is 7 years enough for all of the allegations that we've just heard about her behaviour towards her own son and his sisters?
I think that we always have to look at these things and understand that we are talking about a different time. Yeah?
Yep.
So I'm not excusing anything. I'm just saying we are talking about a different time. Kids getting their mouth washed out of washing up liquid, that might sound mad to you. That's not mad to me.
Yeah.
That stuff did happen when I was younger. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Kids getting hit by their parents, that's not mad to me. That sort of stuff did happen when I was younger. Kids being humiliated by their parents, having idiot writ on the forehead, you know, being alleged to have had to have stood outside in the rain, potentially having to, unbeknown to themselves, get involved in criminal activity because of their parents. That sort of stuff definitely for me is abusive. And even when you go, oh, well, it was a different time, still not excusable. I don't necessarily think that things like hitting your kids and washing your kids' mouth up with soap and stuff like that, I don't think that that's excusable. But what I am saying is I can understand that it was a different time and things like that did used to take place. But in terms of the actual real bad mistreatment of your kids, which wasn't a thing that at that time was acceptable, like leaving them outside in the rain, like writing on their forehead, all the other accusations she has against us, I can completely understand why they were able to add up all the things that, by the way, Ruth had pled guilty for. That is very, very clear and obvious and needs to be said here, because every time that I see this case discussed, it's like she never pled guilty for these things. She did.
She admitted it, and it wasn't the first time she had admitted neglect, right? So we've already talked about this extensively. She'd gone to Child Protection Services, she'd spoken to the people that were dealing with care quite extensively in the past, and she had said that she was really struggling. As I say, huge cry for help, several times cry for help, and still didn't get the support that she needed, and therefore she was very neglectful, and I don't think there's any argument to that. So at this point, following the trial, Ruth was actually sentenced and sent to Holloway Prison, where she was housed alongside various other hardcore criminals. You have to say, there were killers in there like Myra Hindley. Again, crazy to say that Ruth was reading books on Myra Hindley and now in the same prison as her.
Did you hear the story of Myra Hindley coming into her cell?
I didn't hear this.
So apparently Ruth Neave has said, I don't know whether it was in a book or something, but apparently Myra Hindley came into her cell and said to her, "You're no child killer."
Oh, so she just sussed her. Based on what? Based on body language? Based on the look of her?
Don't know.
I mean, to be fair, she would know a child killer if she looked at them.
Myra Hindley, obviously infamous, notorious child killer, and maybe she knows, you know, what it takes to be one, and therefore she didn't see a reflection of herself when she was speaking to Ruth or whatever, or didn't see someone that was capable of doing the things that she was capable of doing.
Yeah, and it was a correct assertion at the time, wasn't it? And then the final thing that I'll say at this point is that the remaining children that Ruth had were taken into a care and adopted, resulting in her losing contact with them for decades. In fact, I don't actually know if she does have contact with them now. And to be fair, from what I've heard, I don't think they really wanted to have contact with her from this point, and you can completely understand why. So yeah, just to clarify, at this point she was found not guilty of the murder, but she was charged with neglect, and that is really the sort of the end of the story for her at this point. So from this point on, mate, we've got someone that's very clearly not culpable for the murder of Rikki, so there's still a killer at large. So what happens next?
Well, this is actually what might surprise you about the case, and that's the fact that it went completely cold after Ruth was found not guilty of her son's murder. So much so that the police even stated that they would not be looking for any further suspects in Rikki's murder. But in my opinion, there was still a clear and obvious suspect out there. A man who multiple witnesses claimed to have seen with Rikki that day. And that man was James Watson. And being that 19 years went by before the police arrested him, and after he had been a suspect for the murder of Rikki, it's fair to say that James Watson got up to quite a lot in those 19 years. 30 convictions worth of quite a lot, actually. Because after Rikki's murder, James Watson had developed an obsession with the case, and he had even photocopied newspaper cuttings about Rikki, which allegedly he kept on the walls inside his bedroom of the child home. He was also getting nicked for all sorts of petty crimes, substances, theft, burglary, but also he was getting nicked for some way more serious offences. In 2009, he broke into a British Transport police station, and after stealing some things, he actually set it on fire. He was also arrested for carrying a firearm in a public place, and another troubling incident which really does show that even all these years later, he was clearly still someone that could be linked to this sort of crime, and that was the fact that he was convicted of another assault on another man, and this was one that he admitted. And speaking of being linked back to the crime at a later date, an ex-girlfriend of James came out and said that he consistently used to strangle her whilst they were in the act, and also another allegation of dead bird carcasses came in from this ex-partner, but she claimed that he had actually placed these birds around his room, spread out in the same position that Rikki Neave's body was found in. And I think that the picture we're painting here is someone with a deeply disturbing and also troubled, chaotic life in James Watson. And so much so that it begs the question, by 2015, did James Watson even still think about the Rikki Neave case? Well, one person who definitely was still thinking about it by this point was Ruth Neave. And as the 20-year anniversary of her son's death approached, Ruth Neave once again started banging the drum and actually campaigning for the case to be reopened so they could look in to who was responsible. And in November 2015, Ruth appears on Crime Watch, where there is a reenactment of the day that Rikki disappeared. And this specific episode of Crime Watch actually yielded a lot of breakthroughs and a lot of calls into the case. And this specific episode actually featured a potential that Rikki was either with one or two boys on the day that he disappeared. And as I say, this Crime Watch appeal influenced loads of people to call in, with up to 17 calls reporting seeing Rikki Neave with James Watson that day. And this, for me, is personally where I feel that Channel 4 got the go-ahead to film 24 Hours in Police Custody. I think that once they understood that the net was kind of closing in on someone, that's when they did it, because otherwise it would be an extraordinary set of coincidences for them to be filming this cold case. By the way, most cold cases are cold because there's not much to be solved there, and most cold cases don't get solved, whereas the fact that, I mean, it's got to be a great coincidence on their behalf, if not. I think
when you're filming these kind of shows, you have to jump on something that you know could be a sort of a good case to cover, right? So I understand why they did this, but they made it out like it was a cold case, and we know the sort of true story here, in that it's 20 years in the making at this point, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. But regardless, they were able to relaunch the case. They were able to start looking back through, and there was a lot that they needed to look through. But actually, not much sooner than the point in which they relaunched the case, they did find some DNA evidence. And this was specifically taken from a bit of sellotape, basically. I think it's got different terminology, but a bit of sellotape. They use it in the olden days. They put it on the clothes, and then they see if they can uncover fibers, DNA matches, and things like that. And they actually did that at the time to the set of clothes that was found the next day after Rikki's body. And that set of clothes was actually found in a wheelie bin on the Welland Estate. And surprise, surprise, we get a match. Josh, who do you think that match was to?
Surely it's just someone random that's not, connected to this case in any way, because if there was, there'd be some evidence against them.
Course, could be. Or it could be the man that's very much connected to the case, the man that multiple people saw Rikki with that day, and the man that's basically been let to live the life of fucking Riley since that point. And that's James Watson. And therefore, police start looking into James Watson's original statements. And straight away, they're finding problems with it. You know, there were certain timings that were given by James Watson. And I feel that James Watson gave those timings because he thought that they presented him with an alibi. However, they didn't do that. And by April the 18th, 2016, the police finally felt like they had enough to arrest James Watson.
You didn't hear the door. You're a deep sleeper. Right, James, at this time, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Rikki Neave.
There was no, what the hell are you talking about? Didn't really react. He was compliant, he was polite, he just got dressed and quietly came out with us.
Watch your head.
Now, just quickly, because I haven't spoke to you about this, mate, what did you think after watching that footage of him being arrested?
I mean, it's a bit strange, isn't it? He doesn't ask any questions. He doesn't actually ask why he's being arrested. He just complies, which is, let's be honest, a little bit weird in this scenario.
100%. If I was in bed and the police came into my house, the first thing that I'm going to be asking them is, hold on, what have I apparently done? Do you know what I mean? And there's none of that. And I really do think that, look, you can't base a case on this, but fuck me, it can give you an indication that this bloke is probably guilty. But when he gets to the station, he actually starts off going no comment. He doesn't want to talk to the police at all, but it's not for long, because he actually starts talking pretty soon after that, which amazes me. And it's clear to me that James Watson has already been thinking about how he could get caught, because all of a sudden, 20 years after the event, he miraculously gives the police some groundbreaking information. For the first time ever, he tells the police that he did touch Rikki. He picked him up and he claims that he did so to lift him over a fence so that he could see a digger, which could explain why his DNA would then be on Rikki. And he doesn't actually argue when the police officer tell him how significant this is and how he should have really said that to them beforehand when he didn't. He just argues that he didn't think it was significant. And despite there being a lot of evidence against James at this point, the police really felt like they were just one more bit off being able to having banged to rights, being able to have him arrested and understand that he's going to be arrested now. They're not going to have to bail him again. But the problem is they were running out of time to get that last bit of evidence. And that meant that at the end of questioning, the police were forced to bail James Watson.
So he's released on bail at this point. He goes to a hostel in Northampton, but there are strict conditions by the police in that he had an 11 p.m. curfew, so he couldn't, stay out all night, which is obviously super strict. And obviously, every prisoner always, appeals to their own bail conditions. The thing is that James Watson didn't. So on June the 27th, 2016, Watson breached his bail conditions. He didn't turn up to his accommodation, but it didn't just go there. He actually, despite not possessing a passport, fled the country. He managed to get into a camper van that his friend owned, go to Dover and escape England, which he's now a fugitive on the run and it's international. Not only did he get into France, but he actually went all the way to the Netherlands as well, and then he went to Portugal. While he's doing this, Watson is disgustingly posting photos on social media of him sunbathing on beaches, drinking beer. He's taunting all of the authorities at this point. And he actually said to a friend at the time, the best thing is that I don't even have a passport. I just walked out of the country. He is literally laughing at every single police officer at this point. But weirdly enough, his plan doesn't quite go to plan, in that he eventually runs out of money. He's living on the streets in Europe, and he says to his probation officer on July 14th, 2016, that he actually wanted to return to the UK. So on July 29th, 2016, an arrest warrant is issued for Watson, and Portuguese police actually managed to track him down on August the 2nd, 2016, and he was formally arrested. He's extradited back to the UK, and then at this point you're going, brilliant, they've got him. Finally, we can finally get to trial. Finally, we can prosecute this guy for all of the stuff that he's done. We've got all of the evidence. We know that he's a bad man. So the Crown Prosecution Service, they get him in, they arrest him, and they actually decline to prosecute him in 2016. And that was actually due to insufficient evidence at the time. So Remember this, 2016, this date's really important.
Hold on. If they need to keep him in on bail with, they're not able to prosecute him.
They haven't got enough evidence for a trial.
Well, they have,
apparently.
because he fled the country while on bail.
I don't know what more the Crown Prosecution Service needed beyond all of the evidence that we've already said, all of the eyewitnesses, all of the fibre evidence, all of the DNA evidence, him actually saying that he has come into contact with Rikki now at this point as well. The fact that he was a fugitive. I mean, what more do they need? I cannot believe, this is the biggest twist in the whole story for me. I cannot believe they let him out. So then we get to the point where we're just like, well, what's going on? Well, for 4 years after that, the guy's just a free man. He's out
posting, by the way, on social media, things like that. So when you spoke about a bit of fingers up to the police, it's also a massive slap in the face to the family and friends of Rikki Neave.
100%. And so much so that Rikki Neave's family actually go through this victim's right to review sort of procedure that we have in the UK, which allows families to sort of say there is enough evidence to actually go to trial here, and you guys need to reopen the case and re-look into this. And they actually did. This was actually successful. So in February 2020, after reviewing all of the evidence, the Crown Prosecution Service finally get round to it and actually do their jobs. They did formally charge James Watson with the murder of Rikki Neave. Now, it doesn't quite go to plan from there, though, because, as you can imagine, during the early 2020s, stuff is going on in the world, which means there are huge delays in the court system, which meant that the trial didn't begin until 27 years after Rikki's death on January the 18th, 2022. That's when it formally goes to trial. So at this point, obviously, they're going through all of the evidence that we've already detailed up to this point, all of the DNA, all of the clothing evidence and that sort of thing. But they also heard a lot of evidence about James Watson's childhood, including the fact that 3 days before the murder, Watson had actually told his mother, he heard on the radio, that a child had been strangled and left naked in the woods. Now, the police actually go back and they try to find this radio broadcast and try to substantiate this evidence. And the report actually never existed, which meant, to the police at least, and the jury as well, to be fair, that there was some element of premeditation on the guy who was actually thinking about this. For me,
that would sense a bit of premeditation, especially if we're going by the same standards of what they thought was relevant when investigating his mother.
Exactly. And we're now, obviously, we've got all of the actual evidence to say. Now we're going through all the circumstantial evidence as well. Teachers actually testified about Watson that he was obsessed with the murder itself, and he was actually caught photocopying newspapers about the killing as well. And it wasn't just that. There was also other evidence that was presented to the jury that Watson had sexually assaulted a 5-year-old boy in 1993 and had a history of strangling, as Joey said earlier on, his girlfriend at the time. A care home manager also testified to finding a dismembered pheasant. This was the bird that we're talking about, where he'd actually posed the pheasant at this time. So with all of that in mind, on April the 21st, 2022, after deliberating for just 36 hours, the jury found James Watson guilty of murder with a majority verdict of 10-2. First of all, how the hell did two people deem that he wasn't guilty at this point? I will never understand. But get this, you didn't think it could get any worse at this point after all of the failings of the Crown Prosecution Service and the police up to this point. But he was only charged as a child. He wasn't actually given the full sentence of an adult at this time because the killing actually took place when he was a young boy.
Here's my problem with that. All of the actions that you used to evade police, you weren't a child for. No. You were an adult for. So yeah, all right, you can trial someone for the killing as being a young boy. I personally don't think that you should, to be completely honest. But what about all of the subsequent actions that took place once you were then an adult? And
also all of the other potential crimes that might have been missed in this period as well. So I can't believe that he was tried as a child, but that's, to be fair, that's the letter of the law. And so he had to be tried as a child, which meant, yes, he was deemed to be given a life imprisonment sentence, but because he's a child, he was only given a minimum sentence of 15 years. And not only that, Joey, I don't know if you know this, but the judge also credited him with over 2 years of time that he'd already served in custody at this point. So that it meant that he actually only served, or should only serve, a minimum of 12 years and 8 months from the date of sentencing.
I've got something that will infuriate you even more.
Go on.
He's already going through the process of appealing his sentence. So despite the fact that normal people like me and you can look at that and go, fuck me, if you hadn't already got off the luckiest of lucky, it's even more so because you've only got 15 years, yeah? We look at that and think that. He looks at that and thinks, I should be appealing this.
I've also got something that's going to annoy you even more than that thing that was going to annoy me even more, mate. So get ready for this. There are indications from people around the prison system that has said that Watson has actually completely refused to engage with any rehabilitative programs around his psychological treatment and that sort of thing. And he also has never actually formally admitted guilt himself. And again, yes, maybe this will factor in against whether he will actually be given parole. They often do. But he's not really engaging in the system.
Prison is designed for rehabilitation.
Yep.
Yeah. Whether we believe or not that can be served in most cases, I think I'd personally say that it can't be served every time. But if that's the aim, then yeah, to be able to get out even on time by that sentence, you would need to be showing signs of rehabilitation.
Yeah, you hope so. And at the moment, based on what I'm reading, I can't see anything based on that. And now also, following his conviction, police have actually said that they're going to start looking into other crimes that Watson may have actually committed during his time that he was outside of the jail. And by what I'm reading, apparently there is more and more evidence coming to light that he did commit other crimes and he may be convicted of other things that he'd committed.
Yeah, which doesn't really surprise us that much. I mean, we spoke about building a profile of a killer and everything we heard, mate, it's like manuscript, isn't it?
It is. And look, you've got to look into childhood trauma, and he clearly had a lot of childhood trauma as he was growing up. You see that as he developed into a young adolescent, and then you see the way he's behaving as an adult. I would be incredibly surprised if there weren't more victims of this man.
Here's the problem, mate. We do these sort of cases week in, week out. Can you remember one where there wasn't a child involved or a person involved that had suffered from childhood trauma?
No. It's
do you know what I mean?
often
So
a precursor.
I feel like we always need to say it because it is relevant and it is important that we shine a light on it. But at the same time, I can sympathise with a lot of our viewers that will comment and say, listen, that's not acceptable. It's not excusable. It may be a factor, but it's not, an excuse. And I completely understand that. I think that the appeals that James Watson's putting in will ultimately fall on deaf ears. I very much think
hope so.
that they should. 15 years is a ridiculous sentence for him to be out. I suppose it does finish off on us asking the question of, Rikki Neave's mother, Ruth.
Yeah.
Was she ever... I don't want to use the word sort of exonerated because the things that she was sent to prison for were real crimes. I do have to ask the question, if there wasn't tragically a deceased child here, would she have gone to prison?
Well, this is the thing, but perhaps not based on the track record that I had.
I would say probably not.
And also, this is why I'm feeling so conflicted about this case, because you're dealing with a grieving mother. And at this point, we have sympathy for the families and the friends of the victim. And, we feel so much for those families that have to deal with all of this trauma. She went through a lot of trauma. She had to go through a court case where she was accused of her own son's murder. Yeah. She then had to wait 27 years and go through all of the court battles to even get, James Watson into the dock.
In the meantime, the man that she ended up coupling up with, who obviously Rikki had his surname, he died unexpectedly too. There was a lot of stuff that went on in her life, which would have been massively traumatic. At the same time, I think that every bit of sympathy we feel in this case is directed at Rikki Neave himself, really, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And this is the thing, I'm so conflicted with it because she did awful things, Ruth, but you have to feel for her as a mother. A son was taken away from her and she was begging Child Protective Services to take him away and look after him. So from a maternal perspective, you've got to feel sorry for her. But the neglect, all of the physical violence she was doing on her own children, the fact that some of her own children now still don't even speak to her, I think professes the fact that she was how can you even say this delicately? She was a bad person at the time. That's all I can really say delicately in terms of explaining it.
Yeah. It's definitely been a sensitive one to cover, but like always, we try and make sure we cover as many of your recommendations as possible. And this one's been recommended to us loads of times from the members of our channel. You got your subscribers and you got your members, but the benefit the members are getting rather than the subscribers straight away is they're getting the episodes up to 48 hours before the general public, before our subscribers are getting them. So if you do want to become a member of the channel, which helps support us massively, there is a link below in the description. We hope you've had a fantastic 2025, don't we?
We do. And thank you so much for all of your support on this channel. We've grown a wonderful community and a lot of people that I deem now to be friends that watch us, exactly, that are commenting, that are suggesting stories. And we know so many of you have not only supported the channel, you've supported our sponsors as well, and supported us to be able to create these videos for you. We honestly love making every single one of these.
Without these lot, the channel wouldn't be going right now.
Exactly. So to get to this point now where we're at, of a channel that we had no idea how successful it was going to be, is absolutely massive. We have had a huge year and it's all thanks to all you guys. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for all of your support for 2025. And we wish you a very, very happy 2026 as well. Thank you so much for watching. If you did want to watch another video, there is one on screen now.
I'm just whispering it to him there. Yeah. Joanna Dennehy.
Yeah, let's go. Let's go for Joanna Dennehy. That would be a really good one, based on Peterborough as well. And as we say, probably the most notorious female serial killer in UK history. Yeah. If that doesn't get you to watch it, I don't know what will. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.